أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. We've been speaking these past couple of days about life's priorities and trying to reflect on them and examine them with the intention that if we can reflect on priorities, we can maximize the effectiveness of our change and redirect our lives in a way that's most significant. Because if we make small changes in our life, particular changes in our life, then the effect is also very limited. And it's just much less efficient if I change one thing at a time. But if I can change my perspective on something, change my whole way of thinking about things, put things in order and decide what's most important, then everything else falls into place and it becomes very clear how to direct my life. So we talked about dying well for these last 2 days. Today I want to focus on something that's also extremely important, and this is priorities in terms of education, both religious education and also secular education. So clearly we know that both are very important and we're all engaged in it, we're all engaged in trying to promote it in our communities and our families, within ourselves. But there's certain things I think that we are doing, certain perspectives that we have and priorities that we have that make our educational efforts sometimes inefficient and sometimes even misguided. So we're focusing on the wrong things. If we can change our focus, then we can do things in a better way and our efforts will bear better fruits, inshallah. So I'm going to give you several bullet points and just ideas to think about so that we can rethink the way we look at education, both religious and secular. So one of the things that I found with religious education is that we tend to focus on particulars instead of focusing on the big picture. Oftentimes, if you look at Sunday school curricula, and I've spent some time looking through the available ones, madrasa.net, which is commonly used, and many of the other ones that are used at different centers. And one thing I noticed is that we tend to teach our kids particular pieces of information, discrete pieces of information. So for example, if we want to teach them about the imams and imama and these kinds of things, very often, the first thing we teach our children is, for instance, their names, their birth dates and their death dates, and where they lived, where they were buried, and these kinds of things. So those are individual pieces of information, but if you step back and think about it, how important are those pieces of information, and does knowing those pieces of information really constitute knowing the imam? And it doesn't. That's certainly not the most important thing to think about. And it doesn't really help a person to know the imam any better. So if we think about imama, for instance, this is one example, right? If we think of imama and talk about it in a way that focuses on big issues first, right? First of all, talk about leadership in general and the importance of leadership, and imagine scenarios where you have no leader in a group and what happens to that, right? If you think about that and think about the need for leadership, that's a much better place to start. It gives you a big perspective on the importance of this position, and then you can kind of connect that to this particular kind of leadership of someone appointed by God, most qualified, best qualified, with knowledge and character and charisma and all these things. And then you have a sense for really the importance of the position, and then you can go in and talk about particulars and say, here are the individuals who have fulfilled this position in history, and let's learn about their biographies and things like that. So then the particular information becomes meaningful because it's part of a bigger whole. You have a map, right? One thing I've done through Islamic literacy over the past, 7-8 years, I've designed a course called Islam 101, which has really helped people to develop that kind of a map for themselves. Right? One of the things that we find in our communities, especially for adults, the majority form, or the primary form of education that we have is these kinds of lectures. And there's obviously no curriculum in these kinds of lectures. Especially in a center like this where you have quite a few people coming, probably on a weekly basis you have at least one speaker, maybe even more speakers coming through. You're exposed to a lot of ideas, which has its own pluses of being exposed to various ideas and various kinds of ways of thinking and so forth. But then there's no overarching connection. There's no program. We don't coordinate and say, we're going to talk about these topics and in this order, and I'm going to start from here to here, and then you pick up from there and continue and stuff like that. We don't have that kind of a system in place. And so we end up with an understanding of Islam that's very particular again, discrete. So now I've talked to you about these particular topics, given you a couple of hadith and a couple of verses. So where does that fit into some bigger picture? Right? And I'm kind of talking about high-level things, priorities, but what if I came in and talked about the history of a particular imam, but you don't have a good picture about where that imam fits into some larger history? So it's useful, to some extent, you learn some facts, but you don't learn how that fits into some more, a broader perspective. So what I've tried to do through Islam 101 is to give my students a kind of an overview of Islam, all the beliefs, all the practices, in a kind of an intuitive way that builds from rationality. Right? You start with reason. We don't even touch the Quran or any sort of revealed guidance until like week 4. So 3-4 weeks, we're simply talking rationally and logically and saying, what can we know if we squeeze our intellect and push it as far as it can go? What can we know for certain just using that? How much of God can we know? How much can we be certain of? How much of expectations can we have just rationally before we even open the Quran and start to examine that as a form of guidance? Right? And then we build, and so by the end of the class, yes, they've learned particular information too, but most important is that they come away with kind of think like an accordion folder, a file folder with all the proper labels in place, right? Everything in order. So the folders they're going to be only partially filled with information. But they have the file folder, which is extremely important. Now they know when they attend this lecture and they hear something about a particular topic, about the infallibility of the Prophet, they know where that fits into the larger picture. They know which folder to put it in and how it fits in and why that's important in the bigger whole. Right? I think that's an important step to take. And we don't have many ways to do this. It takes some effort on your part. This is an effort that I've engaged in. Our Sunday schools also need to reflect that more. There are efforts to develop new curricula. There's an MCE program out of the UK. The Khojas have worked on, and they're starting to unroll that. What do you call it? Roll that out, and hopefully that will address this in some way. I'm not sure how they've approached it, but in any case, when you're teaching your own children, have this perspective. Develop yourself first, have a grand scheme, and then help them to understand the bigger picture first, and then only afterwards the particulars. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Another thing to think about, this is the second idea to think about in terms of reprioritizing our education of Islam, or on Islam. So oftentimes we focus on knowledge and skills. We don't focus on habits and attitudes as much. All right, so think of how you have taught your kids at home, how you might teach them at Sunday school if you're Sunday school teachers, those of you who are involved in the administration. So oftentimes we'll teach them, for instance, how to pray, which is theoretical knowledge. We might even demonstrate and watch them do it and then correct them and make sure that they're doing it correctly. So they build a skill as well. So they not only theoretically know how to pray, now they actually practically can do it as well. And I think that's probably where we usually stop. At least in a school setting, in a Sunday school setting, that's done, check, and then you move on to something else. Which is good. Again, those are all necessary. You have to know how to pray and you have to actually be able to do it and implement it. That's correct. But even more important than that is to emphasize building prayer as a habit. Right? It's one thing to know how to pray, but then to now make this into a habit, incorporate this into your life, and regularly have that consciousness, always be aware of when the next prayer time is, how am I going to plan my activities so that I'm ready at that time to finish what I'm doing and get ready for prayer. Right? To have the consciousness that, as soon as I hear the adhan at home, if you have an adhan, a system with an alarm clock or a computer or something that will remind you. So you have a system where you hear it and everyone's moving in that direction and automatically things start to work. So it just becomes a habit. There's no chasing people down and calling them and reminding them and those kinds of things. Rather, it's an automatic thing. It becomes a habit, and it's just something you do on a regular basis. Perhaps even more important than that is having the attitude that's correct towards prayer. You can imagine you can know how to pray, you do it, and you do it regularly, but what about your attitude? If your attitude is like, okay, I've got to pray again, leave my enjoyable activities off, really important activities off, I've got to put it aside for a second and pray, check it off, get it done with so I can get back to what's really important. Right, if that's my attitude towards prayer, then that's an incorrect attitude. I'm doing it, I'm satisfying my legal requirements, I won't be punished for not praying, but it's not really Mi'raj al-Mu'min anymore. It's not this ladder that takes me closer to Allah, because my attitude towards it is that it's just something I have to do. It's not really important, but I've got to do it just so I don't burn in hell. And that's the point of prayer. Right? So it's not a way of getting closer to Allah, it's just a way of kind of a life jacket so I stay out of hellfire. Right? And that's shortchanging the institution of prayer. So the habits are really important, and the attitudes are really important. Habits can't necessarily be taught, but they need to be trained. So like instead of just teaching, we have to also think about training. Right? Training ourselves, and we're talking about kids because that dynamic is there, but for this to happen, especially for the habituation to happen, it's got to be demonstrated. Right? So oftentimes what happens is parents will be very zealous about Islamic education for their children, but not so much for themselves. Either they think that basically I know everything that I need to know, which is always false, or they think it's too late, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, which is also false. So these kinds of things get in the way, but what really has to happen is that the parents, the teachers, whoever's in the position to train the children, they need to first and foremost learn that knowledge, those skills, and then develop the habit themselves. And especially at home, this is so important. Right? You demonstrate that, and if you demonstrate it, then the chances of your children also adopting those habits is great. And if you yourself are telling and not doing, right? يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لِمَ تَقُولُونَ مَا لَا تَفْعَلُونَ كَبُرَ مَقْتًا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَن تَقُولُوا مَا لَا تَفْعَلُونَ. Yeah, in Surah As-Saf, Allah says, "O you who believe, why do you say what you don't do?" And Allah's anger is great upon those who say what they don't do. Right? So we don't want to have double standards, and kids are the most observant when we have double standards. Right? We might be able to justify it to ourselves in our own mind, but they will be very keen especially as they get older, in their teenage years, they start to be more critical. It's very clear to them that you're telling me to do something, but look, you're not even doing it yourself. And as soon as that happens, then your credibility is shot. You have no more moral high ground to be able to tell them anything, because there's no validity to it. You're not even living by your own words. So that's also, I think, very, very important. And the attitude can be taught, but again, the attitude has to be lived as well. And think about, what is your attitude towards prayer? Is it that it's a chore that you have to take care of, or is it something that you're working towards? That's really the goal of your day, and you're trying to do everything else so you can get ready for prayer, rather than I just have to check it off and get it done with so I can get back to what's most important. Right? So that attitude can be demonstrated, and then that will slowly be transferred if it's done in a wise and careful way. A third idea to think about is that the best education, Islamic education especially, happens at home. As much as Sunday schools and as much as Islamic schools are important, and we should continue developing them and making them better, I've honestly never seen successful children, and successful in terms of their Islamic development, as the product of a Sunday school or institution. All the children that I know, all the teenagers and the people who have gone through systems, the ones that are model Muslims, the ones who are the kinds of Muslims you look up to and say, I hope my kids will turn out like that. They're like that because their mothers and their fathers have really worked with them at home. For those families, typically Sunday school, the challenge of Sunday school is, are my kids going to maybe lose something if they go to Sunday school? Are they going to be influenced negatively by their peers because my kids might I've trained them more, I've taught them more, they're more knowledgeable, more practicing than many of their colleagues at Sunday school. But they oftentimes, those families, because they have this attitude, they also engage with Sunday school and with community because they see other benefits. Not an educational benefit necessarily, because the kids might not learn anything new in Sunday school that they haven't already taught at home. But now they have social interaction, which is positive. Any social, to an extent, any social interaction with Muslims is going to be good and positive and something healthy for the children. But my point is that we should never think that institutions can take over in the role of parenthood. I've seen this in Iran as well. One of the challenges that the Islamic Republic has faced since the revolution is that as the system is a Muslim system and a Shi'i system, and even the school system, the public school system is a Shi'i system. There's no religious and public education there. There's no dichotomy between the two. All public education is also religious education. And so the diniyat and the religious education is a part and parcel of your studies all throughout school. So you learn Arabic and you learn your aqa'id and your ahkam and all these different things as part of your regular curriculum alongside your math and science and everything else. So one of the challenges that they faced is that as the school system has taken over these roles since the revolution, parents have maybe subliminally or maybe consciously, they've developed the attitude that, well, they're taking care of it, so it's not my responsibility anymore. And that's a terrible mistake, and it shows. Right? Those families who have that attitude and say the school will take care of my kids and raise them for me, the kids don't turn out very well. Typically, I'm talking typically, right? There are always exceptions. And those that are successful, they're successful because the parents themselves remain engaged and they realize that my role is primary. The school will take care of other areas and they'll do their own thing, but I'm still a parent. I have a responsibility to train my kids and teach them and make them the kind of children that I want them to be. And so I'm really the main player in this education of my child. Another thing to think about with our education in Islam is that, like I mentioned, primarily our education system is through these majalis and lectures. For adults, we don't really have many other venues. Again, maybe your community is exceptional, maybe you have adult education classes, maybe your local scholar has classes and these kinds of things, but typically it's these majalis, maybe Jum'ah khutbah. So these public addresses tend to be the main form of education. Unless, again, you engage in listening to lectures on your own, in studying on your own, you have study groups and those kinds of things. So when that's the case, then we end up with a very passive sort of an educational system. Right? In educational theory, you have teachers amongst you. You know that passive education is the most ineffective of educational styles. Lecturing is the worst kind of education. And that's what we engage in. That's what I'm engaging in right now. I'm talking to you, you're listening. And there's so much opportunity for you to phase out, you get distracted. There's so little opportunity for you to retain anything. Even with all the best intentions and the most concentration you can muster, the retention is very low. There's no critical analysis at this point. There's no discussion. There's no back and forth. Right? So it's really the worst kind of education, and that's our primary form of education for adults. Right? So again, there's a role for this, and I'm not advocating that we should quit this whole institution of majalis and lectures, these kinds of things. It's necessary. We have the Prophet and the Imams also engaging in this kind of a thing, so they've set the precedent for it. But as now we're recognizing that's not the most effective way of education. It has its own role. Like Jumu'ah khutbah, for instance, it's not primarily an educational platform. Primarily, Jumu'ah khutbah, it's a political and a kind of a rallying call for the weak. Ideally, that's when the Prophet, the Imam, someone appointed by the Imam, someone in a position of authority can address the community and kind of reflect on the weak, talk about politics, talk about life issues, make stances and say, here's some conclusions we need to draw. This is how we should be thinking about it, and here's the direction for the next week. This is what we should be doing in the coming week, in the coming months. Right? So it's a leadership kind of platform where the leader of the community comes out and does all of these sorts of things. Which, of course, that's education, but it's also motivation and moving the community and exercising leadership. It's not a class, right? Classes have to be regular and constant and engaging and these kinds of things. So one reflection I have, and maybe in your heart you won't like it, but one of the reflections I have is in communities, especially communities like this, many traditional communities, we have such a plethora of majalis during the season that really it ends up sometimes taking over your life. Instead of being a concentrated kind of quick dose of impactful information, impactful ideas, if it ends up that you're going to 3 and 4 majalis a day, right? You're traveling between majalis and you're spending time both listening and then all of the other things that go with it and the food and all these things. Whatever lessons you've learned during these 40 and 50 days of majlis season, right, you haven't left much time for yourself to be able to reflect and even less to act and do anything with that information. Right? So if I give you a lecture on a series of lectures on the importance of Quran and get you all excited about reading Quran and that sort of a thing, but then your schedule for the next 3 weeks is packed with majalis, it's either work or majlis, then when are you going to have time to read Quran? So you can't even do a basic thing like that that you now know you want to do, you're inspired to do it, but now you haven't left time enough for yourself to do it because of this kind of culture and schedule. So again, it's not against the culture, it's not against this, but we should do it more in a more thinking way. Personally, if I have 10 impactful majalis and 10 impactful majalis during the first 10 days, right, that's very beneficial for me. But if it continues, the longer something continues, the more frequent it is, the less impactful it gets. Right, there's a reason why Allah also concentrates things. He tells us certain days are special. Right, out of the week you have Fridays that have a special significance, Thursday nights that have a special significance. He could have said every day is a great day for dua, every day is a great day to fast, every day is a great day for this, and then there wouldn't be any sense of urgency. It'd be Monday, and I'd say, well, it's a great day to do so many different things, but Tuesday is also a great day to do it. So I'll put off till Tuesday and then Wednesday, and everything's special, so nothing becomes special. Right? So he also has parceled off and said, certain times of the year are extremely special. Concentrate your ibadah, like an extra surge during Ramadan. Right? Of course you can fast throughout the year, but this is a special time, special significance. You have extra time because you're not eating. Right? So engage in extra worship and extra connections and these sorts of things during that month. So that it takes on, it has significance. We look forward to it, we plan for it, we devote time to it, we sacrifice other kinds of parts of our life it's just for a short amount of time out of the year, so we're willing to do it. But now if he says, well, it's supposed to have to fast every day of the year, and it is supposed to have to fast any day of the year except for the Eids, the 2 Eids. Other than that, it's good to fast. And then the impact goes down, right? And it's no longer special. So we should just think about our majlis culture as well and see, is the practice that we have most beneficial to us? Is this really inspiring us and giving us not only inspiration, but also leaving us time in our lives to be able to actually implement and have that life-changing experience in our life? Recite one salawat, please. One last thing I wanted to talk about with Islamic education is that there are many topics that are taboo culturally that are extremely important in reality. And as parents, as educators, as public speakers, there's sometimes an unstated, sometimes a stated prohibition against talking about those sorts of things. We should, again, really think critically about these taboos and see if there's any sort of reason behind the taboo. Typically, taboos are really nonsense restrictions that we've imposed when they shouldn't be there. There's a hadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, where he says, Al-haya'u haya'an. So haya, he says, there are two kinds of haya. Haya is this sense of shame. Right? So shame typically has a pejorative, a negative meaning in English, but we know Islamically that word haya and even the concept of shame has a positive meaning as well. It's usually, in our context, it's usually used as a positive thing. It's a sense of decency. Sometimes it's translated as decency instead of shame. So it's basically the force within you that pulls you back and makes you stay away from things that are reprehensible. That's haya. But the Prophet says there are two kinds of haya. Haya'u aqlin wa haya'u humq. There's one kind of haya which is rooted in the intellect, and there's one kind that's rooted in idiocy and foolishness. Right? So if I stay away from actual indecency, I have a sense of shame and I decide I'm not going to expose myself in that way, I'm not going to engage in that kind of activity, I'm not going to talk about that kind of a thing and say those kinds of words because it's shameful and I feel personally embarrassed, or what would people think, or even more noble than that, what would Allah think, and how would Allah see me if I engage in this, then that's the right kind of haya. That's haya'u aql, because now I'm using my intellect to make an evaluation and say, where's the greatest good in doing this or in not doing this? And so the intellect says, wherever the greatest good is, that's where you should put your money. The greatest good is in refraining from these acts, so I'm going to do that. That's intellect. That's rational thinking in choosing your actions. Haya'u humq, the shame of a fool, is, for instance, somebody's talking and they say something and I didn't really understand that term. I don't know what he's saying, but it looks like everyone else understood. And I don't want to ask, because if I ask, everyone will know I'm dumb. Everyone will think that I'm ignorant, and they all know. And so I stay away from asking because I'm too ashamed to admit that I didn't know. And so now this kind of shame is idiocy. It's stupidity. And it's going to leave you in stupidity as well. So the word, I'm using a harsh word, but that's the word the Prophet uses as well. Humq, ahmaq, is the word for idiot. Right? So I'm not using a term that's not being used by the Prophet himself. So that's what taboos are. These taboos around conversations, especially important topics. This is haya'u humq. Right? So an important topic is, for instance, we have health classes in the public school system. Right? Health classes are kind of a euphemism for sex ed and these kinds of things. Right? And so we typically will say, not sign the permission form and say, my child is not going to study it at school, which is a good decision usually. But then, do we supplement that at home, and do we make sure that we cover those topics and broach those subjects with our child at home, or in Sunday school, or in some other sort of healthy environment where we can inculcate those ideas and talk about those things in a real way. From an Islamic perspective, typically we have this taboo against all of it. So we don't let them study it in school. We don't talk about it at home. It's never talked about in the masjid, not in Sunday school. If anyone does even say the word, or even talking about it, that's taboo. Right? And so really the loser is our kids, who never get to learn about these kinds of issues that are so important. Some are physiological and biological, and some are behavioral and social. And all are important, all are relevant, all are necessary. And without that guidance, they're going to be left alone. And the only guidance they're going to get is going to be from peers who are probably not Muslim. And that information is not going to be in any way sound and good. And so the decisions they make will be also ahmaq, also foolishness and these kinds of things. Right? So in our education system, when we're talking about Islam, we shouldn't ever have this sense of taboo. This is propriety that we can observe. Talk about things in an appropriate way, in a wise way, what has the maximum effect. But not to simply say, don't talk about such and such. Like that, this is a prohibited topic. We don't mention that word. If it's something that's useful and necessary, then it needs to be talked about. And ideally, it should be talked about by people who are most qualified. Right? But our community sometimes even they'll put a taboo on scholars that they shouldn't talk about these kinds of things. Definitely not from the minbar. And if that's the way, then we're going to just kind of keep ourselves in a state of ignorance, and the consequences will be terrible. All right, recite salawat. I was hoping to talk about secular education as well, but inshallah I have to wait for another time. I'm going to share one more story with you from the aftermath of Karbala. This is actually the sermon that Lady Zainab delivered in the court of Yazid. So the background to this, I recited a poem the other day that Yazid recited. So he actually recited that poem just before she delivered the sermon. So her sermon is really a response to this poem in particular. This was Layta Ashyakhi bi Badrin Shahidu Jaza' al-Khazraji bi Waq' al-Asal. I would that my ancestors from Badr could witness the grief of Khazraj when our spears struck. And then he goes on and says, the Hashemites bedabbled in power, no prophecy was given, no scripture revealed. I am no son of Khindif. Khindif was one of their ancestors, and one of the ancestors of all Quraysh. And so he says, I'm not a true Qurayshi, I'm not a true son of Khindif if I don't take revenge on the progeny of Ahmad for what he once did. Right? So Karbala in his mind was revenge for Badr. So Lady Zainab says, praise is for God, Lord of all realms. May God shower His mercy on His messenger and on all his family. God Almighty spoke the truth when He said, the end of those who do evil is that they repudiate the signs of God which they used to mock. O Yazid, do you think that by blocking our escape and herding us around as captives are herded, that God thinks lightly of us and that He holds you in esteem? That you are great before Him, and for this reason you flare your nostrils and sit in pomp and contentment because you see the world and all your affairs coming together for you? Tread easily. Tread easily. Have you forgotten that God has said, let those who reject God not surmise that our respite to them is good for them? We give them respite only for them to increase in sin, and for them there is a degrading punishment. Yabnat Tulaqa, who were graciously given amnesty by my grandfather, is it just that you modestly conceal both your free women and slaves, and that you herd the daughters of the messenger of God as captives after ripping off their coverings, exposing their faces, letting God's enemies drive them from city to city, letting people at every watering hole and corral gaze upon them, letting people caress their faces, be they related to them or unrelated, wretched or noble, with neither a friend from their protectors with them, nor a guardian from their men? But how can restraint be expected from one whose tongue has tasted the liver of the pure, whose flesh has grown off the blood of martyrs? And how can one be expected to refrain from hating us, the Prophet's family, who looks upon us with contempt and shamefully says they would cheer and howl in jubilation and then say, Yazid, may you never fail. You say this while knocking on the incisors of Abu Abdullah, the master of heaven's youth. And why would you not say this when you have taken such pleasure in rubbing salt in our wounds and ripping out our very roots by spilling the blood of the progeny of Muhammad and the precious gems from the progeny of Abdul Muttalib? You call out to your ancestors and you think they can hear you. No, but you shall soon go where they have gone. And you will wish that you had failed and that you had been dumb, so that you could not have said what you said or done what you did. O God, grant us what is our due. Take revenge for us from those who have wronged us, and release your anger upon those who spilled our blood and killed our ancestors and killed our protectors. Yazid, you have flayed only your own skin, and you have cut only your own flesh. And you shall meet the messenger of God with the blood of his progeny on your hands, and their rights trampled under your feet. On that day will God set their affairs aright and ensure that debts owed to them are paid in full. Do not consider those who have been killed in God's way to be dead. Rather, they are alive with their Lord and sustained. It is sufficient that God will be our judge, that Muhammad will be your opponent, and that Gabriel will be our supporter. Very soon, he who enabled you to step upon the necks of Muslims will know what an awful exchange he made by choosing you as his successor over honoring the terms of the treaty, and which of us is in a worse station and with weaker forces. Since fate has forced me to address you, let me tell you that I consider you bereft of any worth, except maybe that you are worthy of blame. And I would blame you more, but my eyes wish only to cry, and my chest heaves with grief. Oh, how awful that the noble army of God has been killed at the hands of the army of Satan, who were graciously given amnesty by my grandfather. These hands of yours are drenched in our blood. This belly of yours is bloated on our flesh. You are the wolf who mutilated their pure bodies. You are the hyena who soiled their corpses as you stripped them of their valuables. If you consider us to be spoils from which you stand to benefit, think again. For we are for you nothing but loss and detriment. You will realize this on the day when you have nothing but the deeds you have done, when your Lord exacts justice, and he is never unjust with his slaves. To God alone do I complain, and upon him alone do I rely. So devise your plans, strive as you may, and unleash your fiercest attack on us. By God, you will never efface our memory. You will never erase the revelation that came down to us. You will never wash the disgrace from your hands for what you have perpetrated. Your plots are weak. Your days are numbered. Your great hosts are doomed to be scattered. Beware of the day when the crier will announce, "May God damn the oppressor." All praise is for God who has written felicity, forgiveness, martyrdom, and mercy for the first and the last of us. We beg God to perfect their reward and to give them more and to replace our lost ones with righteous successors. He is merciful and loving. God is enough, and he is the best to be trusted. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdillah. وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. Allah, we ask you to shower your mercy and blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad. Allah, accept these meager deeds of ours and this remembrance of Imam Hussein and his family. Help us to learn more about you and about the Ahlul Bayt and to follow in their footsteps with action. Help us to increase in our piety and our fear of you. Help us always to do what pleases you and always to refrain from what displeases you. Help us to live lives like the Ahlul Bayt's lives and to die like them and inshallah be raised with them. Allow us to live long enough and to be righteous enough to be alongside and companions with the Imam of our time. Allow us to be his supporters and inshallah to see the success of his government over all injustice and oppression. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Say.